Are we live? Can you hear me, see me, all that jazz? I know there's only one person here, so if you can see me, hear me, just drop something in the chat so that I know everything's working correctly. Is live? Can you see me, hear me? All right, I'm gonna take that to mean you can. So yeah. There's a small group today. Only one person is watching right now. But today we're going to be going over kind of the whole gist of the post-classical era with economics and kind of what happens after the fall of the Roman Empire and China during the classical era and how the economy of the world changes between these eras due to new states forming and the expansion of trade, which is really a major aspect of what we're going to be looking at today and tonight. Here, let me pull up my slides here. All right. There's the Fiveable, social media and stuff, as always. All right. So the first major thing that we're going to be talking about really is the intensification of trade, which is really the major thing that's going to follow every topic that we talk about tonight. And it's really just going to be how during this time period we go from having some localized and interregional trade routes to a huge boom in what happens with trade and with kind of all of that, interregional interaction between peoples and how that affects the economy. So really the major cause of the expansion of trade is really the creation of new trade routes. So we see, and especially the Andes and Mesoamerica, we see these new trade routes that previously weren't there rise due to new empires rising, such as the Aztec and the Inca empires, which really played a large role in the growth of the Americas in general as a formidable, economic zone. And then we do see old trade routes really intensify pretty significantly. So we see our old trade routes from before, the Silk Roads, the Trans-Saharan trade, and the Indian Ocean. They really, we see them kind of blow up during this time period. And then, of course, the Indian Ocean we'll be talking about in pretty much, pretty extreme detail, because the Indian Ocean really, comparatively to other areas, in fact, during this time period, we don't see economic growth be really structured around Europe. We see it actually be structured around the Indian Ocean and around Southeast Asia and South Asia, which is really something different from the rest of world history, where it seems very Eurocentric due to the fact that Europe kind of runs all of the economic activity in the world, when in reality, it's really all about Southeast Asia in this time period. And then we also see some innovations in trade technology. So, for example, we see the invention of the saddle, which really leads to a lot more trade in the Trans-Saharan area, where it's all desert. And so now that we have the saddle, you can use animals to obviously go across deserts, and it becomes a lot more, simpler to travel and to move along these areas. And then we see navigational technology, such as the astrolabe and the compass, which come from the Islamic world and the Chinese, respectively. They really help to, lead people into trade due to the fact that now it's easier than ever to actually become an interregional merchant. And it becomes a much more lucrative, a much more lucrative area of economic growth for a place, rather than just their own domestic production. They're able to now expand out into interregional trade. So here's a quick picture of kind of what it looked like. So really we see that, we have these new trade routes here in the Andes and in Mesoamerica. And then we see that all of the trade routes over here really expanded to a pretty significant amount. So we see, the Trans-Saharan trade is really expanded. The Silk Roads are now a whole network of roads as opposed to just a connection between Rome and China. And really looking at the Indian Ocean here, we can see that there's a collection of trade cities that really connects this whole area in trade that really leads to significant effects that we'll be talking about a little bit later. So here's some pictures of those navigational tools I was talking about earlier. So this picture right here is of an astrolabe. It was used by mostly Muslim merchants in order to track. It used basically stars and other types of astrological events and other astrological they use like the stars and the moon and those types of things in order to figure out where they were actually going. And this really helped, especially Muslim merchants, navigate seas and navigate, around where they didn't know where they were. So if they were in India, for example, and they needed to get around, they could use that to navigate themselves to now Indonesia or to another area, as opposed to just having to kind of wildly guess or use what at the time were pretty inaccurate maps. And then the compass, which was first invented in Song, China, it really, obviously we still use compasses to this day, but this was really one of the most major inventions during this time period, as it allowed now people to figure out actual directional location as opposed to just, like distance. So now they knew, I have to go 400 miles east in order to get to this area, or 300 miles west, or something like that, as opposed to just knowing how far away it is. So it really leads to an influx of trade due to these technological advancements supporting trade and other mercantile activities. It's really another major cause for trade growth would be the spread of Islam during the post-classical era. So we see that during this time period, in 622, we see the rise of Islam as a major religion in the world in general, but we see these new caliphates or religious empires rise and really grow to an extent that, you can see in this map. It really takes part, the whole Middle East. You see all of North Africa. You see this whole area really become just a giant unified area under the Abbasid Caliphate. And really through this growth, it really promotes trade, which again leads to economic growth as a whole, and then the further effects that we'll be talking about in a bit. And this really leads to the spread of Islam as a unifying force for the world. So we see Islam spread even up into Spain. We see it spread down to India, which we'll talk about later. And then we see really all in Africa. Even today you'll find really many Muslim communities as opposed to Christian, or, you won't really find many Jews even, but you'll find mostly Muslims, and especially Northern Africa, where this trade was even more lucrative. You'll see the spread of Islam has really taken its toll on these areas. And that's really noticeable in the cultures and in why certain countries are the way that they are. So really, we also see new trade route groups. So as opposed to just seeing, caravans or other kind of little groups of people trading, we now see things called Caravanserai, which were basically like the Holiday Inn of the Silk Roads. So we see that basically what would happen was, if you were with, say, a caravan or a group of people, you could, stop at these Caravanserai and stay for a little while and then move on to your way. So you wouldn't have to set up camps or just walk all the way, which I don't think many people did. So it really promotes long distance trade, especially as a more plausible way of trading and trading goods specifically. So really during this time, as I mentioned, trade is really dominated by Muslims in the Middle East and in Africa. So we see all down here, Muslims basically control all of this. And then we'll talk about the Mongols in a little bit, which are another major trade group that, like the Muslims, really unify trade in where they conquer. And then we see the Vikings in northeastern Europe. They play a large role, especially in the spread of. They play a large role in basically trade throughout Europe, due to the fact that, as we'll talk about later, Europe's economy was kind of destroyed following the fall of the Roman Empire. So Vikings and other kind of northeastern European groups help to somewhat repair this, kind of drastic inequality between Europe and the rest of the world, which really is going through a major transition that that Europe is missing out on. It doesn't have that technology that the rest of the world has. It doesn't have, it doesn't have anything really. It kind of just has that feudal system that we'll be talking about in a little bit. And mostly we see an influx in trade in mainly luxury goods. So we kind of stop seeing as much of, trade of very bulk goods. We still do see that, especially around sea routes. However, we see luxury goods like spices and porcelain become really major trade goods, as opposed to things like, wood or lumber or other types of bulk goods that are kind of everywhere. And that's due to the fact that really when you trade with someone, if you have that thing, there's no need for you to trade for it. Whereas if you want, Egyptian cotton, for example, you have to either go to Egypt or you have to trade an Egyptian guy who has that cotton something for it. And that's the reason why we see a rise in luxury goods as a trade implement as opposed to bulk goods, due to the fact that really with bulk goods, kind of everyone has it. And it's such a, it's a bulk good for a reason. So we also see that during this time, really, no one's, this isn't blind. Everyone knows that trade is such a lucrative business to get into. And so we see new economic tools actually rise to promote trade. So for example, we see from Song China, we see what's called flying money, which is essentially the first form of paper credit, right? So we see now paper bills actually be used as opposed to gold coins. And they can essentially be used as loans or credit that people use to buy goods as opposed to now this, a bartering system. And so with flying money, they really weren't like, a $5 bill that we have today. It was more like a bond in the sense of like, it was an IOU sort of, where it was like, this piece of paper is worth, however much, gold or silver. And then you could take it to a bank, give it to them, and they would give you your gold. So really, we don't see like this kind of worthless money as we have today. Like our money isn't backed by anything, but we do see new forms of paper credit that rise, and it's known as flying money. We also see formal banking houses rise. So as opposed to just having, rich lenders, we now have actual institutions, financial institutions that rise to really give birth to a new financial system. So we see formal loans start to be made, so as opposed to it just being like, your neighbor loans you $1,000 for whatever. We see now I go to the bank and they give me however much money for me to sponsor a trade expedition, that's the word, and other things, and I have to pay them back with interest. So this leads to a real expansion in the money supply of the world in general, and it leads to a stronger financial and banking system overall. And of course, these systems had their failures and they weren't perfect. Our system today isn't perfect. However, it was a big upgrade, essentially, to comparing to what we had previously in the last time period. And then we see new trade-oriented organizations. So specifically, although Europe didn't have much interregional trade, within Europe there was a pretty lucrative trade within it. So we see all of these trade routes. These were mainly sponsored and run by what was known as the Hanseatic League, which was one of many major guilds that rose during this time period. And guilds are really kind of interesting in the sense of like, they're kind of like clubs, basically, where people with a specific trade would get together and sponsor each other and almost help each other, trade and get economic success, as opposed to just having, like one blacksmith. He might be part of some blacksmithing guild, which is almost like a community of blacksmiths that, support each other and help promote economic growth. So now we're really going to move on to more specific sectional ideas that we really talk about. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is feudalism, which takes place mainly in Europe and in Japan. So the first one we're going to be talking about is European feudalism. So really what happens after the fall of Rome is that instead of there being another empire to rise and take over this whole giant area that the Roman Empire fell, it was either taken by the Islamic world, such as the North African parts of the Roman Empire, or we see that what was left behind after the split in the Roman Empire with, we have East Rome and Western Rome. What happens in Western Rome is that it basically just falls apart. It doesn't come under one main empire pretty much ever again. I can't think, no, never again will it really, unless you count, Mussolini trying to start a second Roman Empire. And so we see in the Western part of Rome, it's really decentralized. You have a bunch of different countries and a bunch of different, not countries, but kingdoms really that rise. So we can see in this map here, instead of having just Rome, we see, the kingdom of the Ostrogoths, we see the Saxons, the Franks, the Visigoths, the Angles and the Saxons, which is why some people might be called Anglo-Saxon today. We see the Celts, Celtic, the Danes, the Slavs. All of these areas are really run by individual kings, as opposed to there being just, the European empire that runs this whole area. And so really what this leads to is a loyalty-based system. So of course, one guy can't run an entire, country of land. And so what he does is he gives out land to rich nobles in trade, basically, for loyalty and for a promise that they would fight for him in order to, if in the case that there was a war. So it's really this loyalty-based system all the way down. So we see the king gives lords land, and the lords promise to give the king loyalty and military aid. And then we see this continue all the way down down the social pyramid. So we see knights rise. We have those, like, this idea of like a medieval knight. That's basically where this comes from. And they promise military service to their lords in exchange for protection and shelter. And then furthermore, we see serfs pay rent and farm land for knights in exchange for protection and shelter. So we see this kind of tiered system where basically I give you something and I'll give you something in return. However, the problem with this is that there's zero social mobility. If you're born as a peasant, there is pretty much no chance that you are ever going to be leaving the land that you were born on. And there were even some instances where you were legally tied to the land, almost like a slave. And it even leads to a very weak economic system. When we think of Europe during the 1200s, we don't really think of, flourishing art and science and culture. We think of people are starving and people are sick. Christianity is kind of messing with science. And we see that the church actually plays a really huge role in all of this due to the fact that there was no one central government that took control over Europe. We see the papacy actually become a major source running the entire economy and running the entire, political well-being of Europe. And kind of, if you weren't a member of the church, you weren't really anyone at all, due to the fact that Christianity, and specifically Roman Catholicism, was the name of the game for everyone. Literally everyone was a Catholic, and if you weren't, you would be basically either killed or banished. And what we see is this leads to a really weak economic system that is basically just sustenance. Peasants have very little money or food of their own, and any food that they have left, they're going to eat. So there's very little for them to actually sell for, for their own economic well-being and for the expansion of trade, due to the fact that any food that they don't use for sustenance goes to their knights, and then any food that, the knights goes to the lords, and the lords go to the king. And so it's this economically unequal system that really leads to the downfall of Western Europe following the fall of the Roman Empire. And so we see this kind of ends around the 1300s. It's kind of a very debatable period when the Middle Ages started and ended. I always say 476 with the fall of Rome to around the 1300s, because what we see now is with the Black Death, right? The Black Death is it's a plague that basically takes out a third of Europe. Imagine living in a town of, maybe 100, let's just say 100 people. Now imagine waking up one morning and 66 of them are dead. That's basically what the Black Death did to Europe, and even, China and everywhere, really. And what happens now is the labor force has been significantly decreased, the supply of the labor force. So the labor market, which, even though we're not dealing with a free market system, the market of labor for labor and the laborers themselves, they start thinking, there aren't many of us left. It's not like my knight or my lord can get anyone else. And so they start demanding more, more rights, more pay, a looser social system. And this really leads to the end of feudalism. It won't lead necessarily to the Renaissance or to any economic growth that we see in the future. However, it does help really put a dent in feudalism. Here, let me see if I can find a picture of the labor market, so we can see if. Yeah, I won't go into this. Never mind. I was going to pull up a picture of a competitive labor market and show what a decrease in the supply does to the wage, but it really isn't important. All you need to know is that when there's a contraction in the labor force, the wage for workers will generally rise. Supply goes up, supply goes down, price goes up. Right? If you think about that graph. So yeah, comparatively, we can talk about feudalism in Japan, right? So we see a very similar, but also very different system in Japan during this time. So really, instead of kingdoms, we see a military shogunate, or really a military warlord, basically, who runs the entire show. So you might be looking at this system and say, wait, but the shogun's all the way down here, whereas the emperor is all the way up here. And that's due to the fact that really there was still an emperor. However, he did have very nice things. He had a very high social standing, but he did not have the political power. He was nowhere near. He was basically like what the Queen of England is today, minus 1,000. He didn't have any political power whatsoever. He was solely a figurehead. And so what happens here is we see a military-based system rise of the shogunate, and then we see samurai, and then we see the rest, basically. And so you can see it does follow a similar system where you have the king giving land to lords who, protect samurai, who protect peasants. And so we see this general system right here is pretty similar to what we see in Europe. However, we do see a more stratified specialization in this, in this area. So we do see, peasants are above craftspeople, are above merchants. And we really see in Japan during this time period the influence of Chinese economics and Chinese culture in general in a process known as sinification. We see Japan really become a formidable. They basically become Chinese in the sense that their culture, their language, and even their governmental setup is very similar to China's due to a tribute system that we'll be talking about later, and due to the spread of Chinese ideas into Asia in general, specifically Korea and Japan. So really, samurai are a really interesting thing to look at with feudalism. So really see that they follow a strict moral code called Bushido, which really it's very similar to the knightly code of chivalry. However, it is much more strict. So we see this kind of theme of strictness and very little social mobility, and really it's so strict that if you broke a rule, most samurai, in order to avoid shame for their whole family, would commit ritual suicide called seppuku, which is basically where they would take a sword and kill themselves in public by slashing their stomachs open. It's obviously, I'm not going to show it here, but it was a very very strict social system and a very gory way to die, but it's a very strict social system, and it's really exemplified by the role of Bushido in the samurai culture. And it's actually a lot more successful than in Europe. We really don't hear as much about the major, starving times that we see in Europe in Japan. And this is mainly due to the fact that it is a lot more there's a lot more social mobility in Japan. It's still very hard to move up, but because of the fact that there is some Chinese philosophy, there is a tiny ounce of meritocracy that we were talking about yesterday. There's a tiny ounce of, if you're smart enough, you can move up the social ladder. It's much more difficult than in China. If you were a peasant, odds are you were going to stay a peasant for the rest of your life. But there were very few examples where it was able to move up the social ladder. And also, due to the fact that Japan was smack dab in the middle of Southeast Asia, they experienced all of the trade and all of the economic benefits that come from being in their location. They're able to actually trade as opposed to being very isolated from the rest of the world like Western Europe is. And it's really something to take into account, that with trade comes economic growth. And it's really something important to note with Japan. So the next thing we're really going to be talking about is the major people in trade. There are very few people that you want to really need to know. However, with this time period, we see new interregional travelers. So these are people who actually just go around and go different places as opposed to go and trade. Many of them were also merchants who traded, but they also took detailed notes of their exhibitions in order to which really today impact our culture and our world as a whole. So the first one we're going to be talking about is a guy named Ibn Battuta, who he was one of the most prolific travelers of this time period really ever in world history total. And so what we see is that he traveled across the entirety of the Middle East and Africa. I mean, if you look at this map, I'll make it a little bigger. You can see that his trade, where he went, he literally went. He traveled over 75,000 miles through the Bay of Bengal, through China. He traveled through the Middle East, through Africa, through Eastern Africa. The only place he really didn't hit, and this is really important to note, is Western Europe. It really was a very economically disparaged area compared to the rest of the world that we see. And so really his travels were so impressive in the sense that he was able to travel so much and write down everything that he saw. That's what makes him so important as a traveler. The fact that he made pretty prolific observations of what he looked at and many comparisons of especially Islam throughout his travels. If you ever read his notes, you'll notice that he talks about places like Africa, and he actually criticizes their use of Islam in the sense of them, they'll allow alcohol, or they'll have other areas that are very different from the Middle Eastern form of Islam, and he'll actually note these comparisons, which allow historians today to draw comparisons between Africa and Middle Eastern countries even to this day. So really that's why Ibn Battuta is so important, not just because he was a really prolific traveler that traveled all over the place and made a bunch of contacts and really influenced the culture of a lot of places. It's really in his writings where his true significance comes out. And that's really his significance. The next person we're really going to be talking about is different in the sense that his major contribution is more economic than it is social and cultural. And so the guy that we're going to be talking about, his name is Mansa Musa, and he was a king of Mali. So basically, if you go back to this map, Mali is basically this empire that was right here. And it was a major trade empire, especially in the trans-Saharan and sub-Saharan African world. And we see that he takes the Hajj, which is a pilgrimage to Mecca. And because he's a king of Mali, he is obviously ridiculously rich. He is beyond our conception of rich. He's literally known as the richest person ever to live ever. You think, who's the richest person ever? You might say, oh, it's Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos. He was beyond richer than them. I think we still don't know how much he's worth, but I think the estimates are in the trillions. Let me Google it real quick. His estimate worth was not in the trillions. It was $400 billion. By comparison, Jeff Bezos is worth today only $164 billion. So this person was literally alone almost 4 times richer than the richest man on earth today. If that doesn't say anything, I don't know what does about this guy. And so when he takes the Hajj, he spent so much money on his caravan. He brought so much gold from Mali that he destroyed the Egyptian economy. That sudden influx of gold boosted the money supply to such an extent that there was massive hyperinflation. And I'm just laughing saying this because this was one guy who destroyed the economy of major cities. I mean, that's how rich this guy was. And in fact, he was the only person in history to controlled the price of gold in the Mediterranean because his purses could either contract the money supply or boost the money supply to such an extent that he basically controlled the price. He could cause inflation. He could pull back on inflation. It's really an incredible thing that he was able to do. And in order to help even solve this, he borrowed all the gold he could carry from moneylenders in Cairo in order to help to spur some economic health, because he took back this gold at a really high interest rate, which led to some economic growth, but also a very high contraction in the money supply, which led to this hyperinflation somewhat calming down. But really I think it was around a decade, the Egyptian economy couldn't recover from Mansa Musa's economic rampage, essentially. And it's really something amazing to note about this guy, that also he's not European. We might think that the richest guy ever was European. You might think he was some big king of France or something, but he was an African king. And that really goes to show a major thing that you should take out of this is that Europe wasn't always on top. You might think, looking at the 1450 area to above, that Europe kind of ran the game. it was all Africa and the Middle East during this time period. So the next thing that we're going to be talking about is kind of the biggest topic of this whole area, and that's really going to be Southernization. So that's kind of a term that is used kind of weirdly. It's not a word that many people use. However, Southernization really refers to the fact that that during this time period, the majority of trade actually took place in Southeast Asia and Eastern Asia, as opposed to in Europe, like we saw before with the Silk Roads and the Mediterranean trade routes. And like I said, most trade actually took place outside of Europe and in the south, as opposed to in the north. And we see that the Indian Ocean becomes a real hub of economic activity. We see the Indian Ocean grow to such an extent that, before we were talking about it as a very light area where bulk goods were stored. Now there's a real demand for luxury goods everywhere, but especially in the south. So we see spices, especially from India, become of really high demand. We see artisans and merchants expanding their production of textiles. We see, Indian cotton and Indian textiles become a real major lucrative trade that continues in India even from until probably the 1940s when India gains its independence. They're really the major source of textile production in the world. We also see things like porcelains and other forms of luxury goods that really are traded in this area alone, as opposed to other different areas of the world. We see Southernization really take its hold in Southeast Asia specifically, especially in India and Eastern Africa. So we can see this map here of trade during this time period in this area. We see that there are major trade cities kind of all over the place. We see Mombasa, we see Mecca, Calicut. We see up here other cities such as Gujarat and other places that become more significant later. And we see Indonesia and China also play a lucrative role here. And so because of this lucrative trade, we see a growth of trade explicitly in India and in the eastern coast of Africa, the Swahili coast. We see that after what are known as the Bantu migrations, which are when basically people migrated from around this area down through the Sahara to this area, we see these new societies pop up on the eastern coast that are really are very sophisticated societies and very economically sound, really economically healthy, due to the fact that they trade all over the place with this area. We see that from Mogadishu, you can get to Calicut, which can get you through Malacca and other areas, which can get you to Hangzhou, which is another city we'll talk about. And so really, it's this lucrative trade in the Indian Ocean that leads to much of the economic growth that we see. And we see that even it's been split up into 3 zones. Really, we see these big purple lines coming through it. We see that mostly this whole area was really Muslim trade. Then we see Indian trade, and we see Chinese trade. And so it really was a sectional trade. However, we do see Arabs go from here to Calicut, and then from Calicut through Indonesia up to China. And so that's really this connection between Africa and China and India becomes a major reason why we see some economic growth even in the future. And we see some even trade opportunities occur due to this growth in the South specifically. So we also see that technology plays a really big role in Southernization. So we see that because of things like new boats and knowledge of monsoon winds, we see that that Southernization really takes its hold on especially the Arabs and the Chinese. So we see, other types of boats, such as this is a boat called an Arab dhow. We see that and Chinese junks, which is what they're called, really become major implements of trade, especially with maritime trade taking place in the Indian Ocean. So we can really draw a stark comparison between this trade that we're seeing and trade previously, in the sense of we can see a change between this in the sense of that the major trade route during the classical era were the Silk Road, these land routes that people would take. But now we see that maritime trade becomes a much bigger and more lucrative trade for people to trade in. And so we can even see now a more detailed look at the trade routes. They go all over the place, up into Alexandria, down through the Swahili coast, up into Saudi Arabia, all of India, basically all down this coast. We see down the Bay of Bengal in modern day like Bangladesh and Laos and Thailand, and even through up to China. So this whole area is now connected. As opposed to just being weak trade routes, we see a really strong trade between these areas. And a major reason why people from especially East Africa were able to get to India were because of monsoon winds. These were winds that essentially were very prevalent during certain times of the year. And so what would happen is that, you would basically leave in April from, let's say, Mogadishu or another place. You would go to, say, Calicut, and then around November, you would leave and go back, or you could obviously continue along and go up to this area. But really, these winds powered trade during this time period, which was a major reason why trade was able to grow. So we also see a major cultural diffusion take place along these trade routes. So we see mainly the spread of Islam along these trade routes, right? We see from the Middle East, if we go back, we can see most of the people trading in this area are going to be Muslim. So when they go over here and here, we're going to see these trade routes expand the Muslim religion, Islam. And we see a new almost group called Sufis, which are Islamic mystics, become the main spreaders of Islam along these trade routes. And it really mainly spreads to Indonesia and other kind of Micronesian countries. And you can even see the effect of this today. We have this graph of Muslim population in 2014. We can see that, obviously, as we expected, most of it is going to be in, the Middle East. However, if you look down in Indonesia, we can see between 80 and 90% of the population is going to be Muslim. We see other syncretic things happen with, say, Buddhism and with Hinduism, especially down here. However, we really can see the effects of the spread of Islam through this area. And we also see the rise of syncretism in this area. So we see the blending of religion through the spread of religion. We see the blending of Islam and Hinduism to form Sikhism by the 1400s. We see Hinduism and Buddhism form a new syncretic religion, which leads to things like Angkor Wat, which I'll pull up a picture of, which is basically a giant Hindu-Buddhist temple, which really exemplifies, again, syncretism during this time period and the cultural effects that trade brings to countries. Here, let me see if I can pull this up. Come on. There it goes. Oh, okay. Here they all are. So we can see this picture of Angkor Wat. First of all, it's just incredibly beautiful, but also it's a really important art piece to show the economic impacts and social and cultural impacts of trade during this time period. We see that this leads to major cultural, almost revolutions in a way. I wouldn't call it revolutions, but you know what I'm saying. Very many cultural changes. So we're going to talk about kind of the economic growth that takes place in China during this time period, because China is really an important thing to talk about, as it was one of the major players in this Indian Ocean trade. So during this time period, we're really going to be focusing mainly on the Tang and the Song dynasties. However, the Sui does play a pretty large role in expanding China's domestic economy. We see them sponsor the Great Canal, which is really a major part of what connected the north and the south of China during this time period and led to a lot of interregional trade within China. So we also see the Tang dynasty expand the civil service system. So remember from before we had that Confucian civil service exam, we see the Tang expand this to new heights. Now there are new classes, new degrees that can be earned by scholars, and really expands the Chinese bureaucracy, which in turn leads to its economic growth. We also see territorial expansion during the Tang. We see them take over tributary states in Korea, Japan a little bit, mainly Korea. Where else? We see them take place areas such as Korea. One sec. Excuse me. Manchuria is another major area. And these areas really, the way a tribute system worked during this time period was essentially the Chinese would take over an area, such as Korea or Manchuria, and they would say, we're going to, have you be part of our empire. However, you're going to pay us tribute and respect us and respect our customs and cultures. It was essentially a very light form of imperialism during this time period. And we see this happen especially also in the Aztec Empire, which becomes a major empire in Mesoamerica. And we see this kind of really contribute to territorial and economic growth as it funds a lot of their major projects. Moving on to the Song Dynasty, we really see them experience extreme economic growth. Economic growth to an extent that we have never seen before. In fact, we see such a technological boom that some historians predicted that around the 1200s, if they hadn't fallen to the Mongols, there was a good chance that they would have had the Industrial Revolution almost 500 years before it actually happened. So it's really something to kind of take in, that they were so technologically advanced compared to the rest that it took places like Europe 500 years to catch up. And so a major one of their inventions, we talked about the compass. They also invent gunpowder, which really impacts future empires such as the Ottoman Empire and the Safavids and Mughals in becoming empires due to their use of gunpowder in cannons and in, obviously, guns in order to take down existing empires. We also see a lot of demographic shifts with the Song Dynasty and the Tang Dynasty, especially in the form of champa rice, which is really a fast-growing form of rice that leads to a population boom, which really leads to cities. And that's really something to take in, that urbanization during this time period is a really important aspect of the trade and of the economic growth of China, as opposed to just technology and tributary systems. We see urbanization become, we see hubs for culture and economic growth, as opposed to being very decentralized. We can see it be centralized in very specific areas, such as Hangzhou, or what would in the future become Beijing. So really, you can see this map of the Tang Dynasty. As you can see, you have the Tang Dynasty all along here with all of their area. They take over basically what is modern day Turkmenistan, this whole area, and obviously what is modern day China. However, they also have, which is interesting, basically all of Korea and Manchuria taken, essentially. And so this is where the tributary system takes its hold, that through Korea and through other tributary areas, we can see the influence of the Tang Dynasty be seen in these areas. We won't see necessarily Chinese people in Chinese territory, but we will see the impact of Chinese economics, politics, language even, really pay its toll on these areas. So really, you can't really talk about this time period without talking about the Mongols. During the 1200s, they rise and become the biggest land empire in history. The biggest empire ever is the British Empire. However, the Mongols become the biggest land empire ever in history, and probably will be forever, since there aren't many major empires rising anymore. So if you just look at this map, you can see that the Mongols basically control all of Asia besides India. They control from Russia all the way through Persia, through the middle, through Asia, Central Asia, and all of China and Korea. The only places they really couldn't conquer are India and Japan. That's kind of it. So it's really that really huge spread of their influence that really leads to their large effects. So what their major economic impact is that they unify the Silk Roads and improve trade. So what we see during this time period is that the Silk Roads become very dangerous to go across. You see gangs of bandits and other very dangerous crowds, obviously, make these trade routes really very dangerous and very hard to trade on, which leads to the growth of maritime trade. However, we do see during this time period, we have what's called the Pax Mongolica, which is the Mongolian peace. They unify and centralize the entire this entire area and make these Silk Roads a lot more of a lucrative and a lot more of a very safe route, which does have its positive and negative effects. It does lead to a lot of economic growth. However, it also leads to the spread of the bubonic plague due to the fact that it can't really be spread by sea all that easily. And so that's why we see the spread of the bubonic plague in this area specifically, as opposed to in, say, India or Japan, due to the fact that they really didn't have this lucrative trade. And another really important aspect of the Mongols is that they were generally egalitarian and utilitarian. And so what those two words mean is essentially because they were nomads, they really didn't care about gender all that much. There was a lot more women's rights in the Mongol Empire than really there are even comparatively in some European countries in the 1700s, during the Enlightenment. We see that there is still a patriarchy. There's no doubting that. However, women were able to own property. They were able to kind of hold their own, and it was really interesting. It's really interesting to see how the Mongols had this sort of egalitarianism because of the fact that they were nomads, as opposed to seeing these established societies be more patriarchal. And then we also see utilitarianism almost start to grow in the Mongol Empire. They would essentially take people and use them for whatever they were best at. If you were better suited in the Khanate of the Great Khan in China, they would most likely have you moved there in order to become a better worker for them. And really, it's a really interesting thing to see how they utilize their people and their cultures so ubiquitously. So we see, for example, in the Muslim empires, Muslim areas, they might be better with writing or with other areas of science and math. So you'll see maybe many Muslim writers go from Persia into China, and this really leads to a bigger diffusion of ideas, really. However, they also allowed these areas to generally keep their culture. They were basically just like, listen, as long as you're loyal to us and you don't try to rebel and take down the Mongol Empire, we're pretty much cool with you doing whatever you want. And so this really leads to a very interesting scenario where, these places were allowed to retain their culture, which is why when we think of the Mongol Empire, we can't really pin down a culture because there was no central culture of the Mongol Empire. And maybe that's because they were so large. However, that's just a major thing to take out of the Mongol Empire, is that they were so large and that they were generally utilitarian and allowed places to keep their cultures. So now we're going to be talking about urbanization during this time period, which is really a major aspect that comes out of the growth of trade. So with urbanization, we see cities grow mainly along major trade routes, right? Where the money goes, cities grow. We see trade cities become real hubs for culture and economic growth due to the fact that they were put directly either on ports or in major trade areas, which leads to these areas becoming extremely rich. We see places like Timbuktu in Mali, Hangzhou in China, and then Calicut and Tenochtitlan in India and the Americas, respectively. They really become large areas and hubs for culture and for art and science. And we see this especially in Baghdad in the Abbasid Empire. They have what's called the Baghdad House of Wisdom, which is really it really exemplifies how the technological and cultural growth of this area was solely due, or at least primarily due to the growth of trade in these areas. Because you can't really have science or art flourish unless you have simultaneously money to back it. If you're too focused on, am I going to be able to eat this week? Odds are you're not going to be working on a painting. You're going to be focusing on working as much as you can to make as much money as you can. And so we see during this time period, because of this excess wealth due to trade, we see the inventions of things like algebra, trigonometry, astronomy really starts to develop, the sciences, the scientific method. We see the protection of very many classical works from Greece and Rome because of the Muslim scholars, really, as opposed to the Europeans. And this really is a major thing to take away from urbanization, is that it helped to preserve culture and lead to economic growth. So that's really what you should take away from urbanization. And then we see economic conflicts rise. So we'll see things like the Crusades, for example, which is the main conflict that we'll see. it's both religious and economic. So we see that people from Italy and from the Byzantine Empire under Pope Urban II, they will invade Jerusalem specifically, which is at this point Muslim and under the Abbasid Caliphate, or at least under Muslims. I don't really know specific dates, but we'll see that they're a flop. They, even today we don't see a Christian Jerusalem. There's a lot that happened in between. However, the Crusades were a flop. However, the one major thing that we see come out of the Crusades is the spread of Islamic culture and inventions across to Western Europe and across into the Byzantine Empire and everywhere. So this helps lead to the European Renaissance, but it's also the first of many future conflicts. We see, conflict between Muslims and Christians. This wasn't the first. This won't be the last. We'll see many in future years, especially in the Middle East, especially in the 1900s and 2000s, of course. And it's really that's kind of something interesting to look at. So really, let's just take a look at what changed between the previous time period and this time period. So this is a map of major classical trade routes. So we see, of course, the Trans-Saharan, we see the Mediterranean, Eurasia, Silk Roads, and then the Indian Ocean. And then if we look at what the map looks like now and what we've kind of gotten to 1450, we really see a huge expansion, right? So we see up in here, we see the Mali Empire, we see the Swahili city-states that we talked about, Islamic Caliphates, the Byzantine Empire, and then we see these major trade routes that grow, especially among Vikings, we see new interregional trade around here. We see migrations occur in Polynesia, which no one really cares about. And then we really see this growth of empire that we will see kind of fall in future, future time periods. You kind of can think about you can't really think of an empire in the 1900s really, besides I guess the Ottoman Empire, but they even fell in 1920. You can't think of really a major empire like this after this time period. They'll become maritime empires and there will be imperial empires. However, we will never really again see this large collected area of land known as an empire. And so it's really something to take away. And so that kind of completes this whole time period. So I know there's only one person watching. So yeah, I'm going to end it here. I hope if you're watching the replay or anything, you enjoyed this, and we'll be back not next Wednesday, but the Wednesday after to talk about really what happens when Europe meets the Americas and what happens when the East meets the West, essentially. So I'll leave you there, and I'll